She thought the house was haunted. A man was living in the walls. It started with the smallest sounds that could be mistaken for wind. A brush against old plaster, a hush of movement above a ceiling. The house on North Sheridan Avenue in Tacoma had survived more winters than anyone on the block, and it spoke the way old houses do, with sighs in the joists and uneven breath in the vents. That is what Maren Wycliffe told herself each night when the noises returned just as the streetlights blinked on and the gulls from Commencement Bay wheeled toward darker water. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a Thursday in late October of 2019, Maren arrived home from the public library just after sunset. Her hands were cold around the metal key. She had been cataloging donated paperbacks all day and wanted nothing more than a hot bath and a quiet hour with a biography she had set aside. The porch light stuttered, on and off, as if welcoming her with a nervous tick. She laughed softly, a single note that sounded like pretend courage, and stepped inside. From the entryway, she could smell damp wood and cedar. The house had belonged to a widowed teacher before Maren, a woman who kept bees and hung dried lavender bunches from the rafters. Maren liked the history of it, the way a home holds on to the people who cared enough to repair it. In the dining room, a framed photograph of Tacoma's old streetcars leaned against a wall that needed patching. In the small kitchen, a square window looked toward an alley where ivy climbed over a fence and kids scrawled bright initials under the utility meters. That night, the noise came again, but crisper. Tap, tap, a scrape. Then silence so complete she could hear the heat switch on in the basement. She set her grocery bag down and stood very still. Her breath found a fast rhythm that made her chest feel too small. She swallowed and called out in a voice that aimed for practical and landed somewhere near shaky. Hello. If someone is here, please answer. I am calling the police. Every cupboard was closed. Every door was locked. A curtain in the hallway stirred, though no window was open. Tap, tap. Then a dragging sound that seemed to move from the far bedroom toward the bathroom, where the clawfoot tub curved like a pale animal asleep. Maren's heartbeat rose and then steadied with a decision. She pulled out her phone and dialed her neighbor across the street, Madame O'Rourke, who preferred the French honorific because she said it made the mailman stand taller when he walked her steps. A retired piano teacher with sharp eyes and a softer smile, she answered on the first ring. Come stand on your porch, Maren said, trying to keep her voice level. Just for a minute, and listen. Within moments, Madame O'Rourke stood bundled in a thick cardigan, her posture precise even in slippers. From the porch, she tilted her head. The street was otherwise quiet, save for a bus a few blocks south groaning up a hill. Maren waited. Nothing. It is an old house, dear, Madame O'Rourke said after a long moment. They creak and clack when the air changes. Do you want Earl to come check the basement later? Earl was her son, who sometimes mowed lawns and sometimes disappeared for weeks fishing on a friend's boat. Maren thanked her, said she would be fine, and went back inside with a heart that would not agree to calm. In the bathroom, she touched the glass of the medicine cabinet. A thin fog from the earlier shower blurred her reflection at the edges. She wiped it away, and out of habit, she adjusted the small latch that kept the mirror shut. The next morning, the latch was open. Maren stood very still and felt a small but ferocious chill start at the base of her neck and fan outward. She had closed it. She remembered the click. She remembered the surety of that tiny sound. She tested it again, and it held fast. She turned her head and listened. The house offered a distant sigh, as if in apology. Over the following week, more minor wrongness drifted into place. A jar of coins turned so the label faced the wall, a kitchen chair pulled half an inch from the table, a speckled mug moved from its hook to the counter, handle angled just so, as if someone had set it down thoughtfully and left for a reason not explained. Each time, Maren searched for proof of her own carelessness, a moment when she had been distracted and left something where it did not belong. Each time, her memory insisted she was not mistaken. The noises were worst just before dawn. She would wake to the quiet thrill of adrenaline and hold her breath until her lungs protested, and in that held breath, there would be the faintest whisper of movement behind the walls. On a wet Monday in early November of the same year, she brought home a new lock for the back door, one with a heavier bolt. She called a handyman named Llewellyn Pardee, a quiet man with a hummingbird tattoo that looked ready to dart off his wrist. He arrived smelling of rain and pine soap. He replaced the lock and checked the basement windows, crouching to inspect the small latches that most people ignored. He tested each one and announced that they were sound. He climbed the narrow stairwell and looked at the attic hatch. He tugged the string and peered up into shadow and dust. "No footprints in the dust," he said, "and no signs the hatch has been moved in a while." He glanced at Marin, kindly puzzled. "You say you hear it mostly overnight." "Mostly," she said. "And sometimes when I get home, like someone is listening for me." His eyebrows pulled together, a small corrugation of concern. Mice could do small mischief, but not pull out a chair. Maybe there is a vent opening in a strange place, causing pressure when the air changes. "I can take a look at the ductwork next week." After he left, the house felt heavier, as if it had exhaled and decided to wait. Marin made tea and carried it to the front room, where a green velvet chair kept vigil by the window. She sat and watched the street, cars sliding past with headlights smeared by drizzle. A woman in a red raincoat walked a beagle that stopped to sniff every microsecond of the world, as if the day's truth lived in damp leaves. Marin pressed her palms to the warm mug and tried to imagine what a rational person would do next. She decided to write it all down. Date, time, detail. She started a notebook and kept it by the fridge. Tuesday, just after 11 at night, hallway creak, 3 steps, then a soft thud. Wednesday, 5:15 in the morning, kitchen drawer open, spoon out, placed on counter. Thursday, just before 8 in the evening, a draft in the bathroom, mirror latch loose again. By the second week of November, she was waking with an ache in her jaw from clenching. Friends at the library noticed her quiet mood. Her coworker, a reference assistant named Etta Holcomb, asked if she wanted to house sit her sister's condo while they were away for the holiday. Marin considered it, then shook her head, slow and firm. Leaving would not answer the question of what was happening inside her own house. It would only stretch the fear across a different set of days and walls. On a wind-colder Friday, the answer began to show itself in a way so clumsy that it felt like a dare. Marin came home and found a single page torn from a magazine tucked under the living room rug. It was a recipe, the edges ragged from hurried hands, and it had been folded into quarters and pressed flat, as if someone had used their full weight to hide it quickly. The recipe was for cider brine chicken. A rectangle of tape clung to one side with lint and grit stuck to its edge. Her mouth dried as she stared. The room's corners seemed to lean toward her, a narrowing. The rug had not been moved since she first put it down in early autumn. She lifted the rug and looked for more, her hands shaking. Dust and a penny. Nothing else. She took the page to her neighbor. Madame O'Rourke pressed her lips together and made a small, dismayed sound. Maybe a draft lifted it from a stack and it floated right there, dear. Under the rug, Marin said. Tucked, then taped. I do not keep magazines like this. And I do not have tape in the living room. Madame O'Rourke's expression changed, the sturdy lines of her face tightening with alertness. Come back to my porch for a bit, she said. Let us think. She poured Marin tea that smelled of orange and clove and brought out a dish of shortbread, placing it on a crocheted mat with small daisies. The porch had seen 100 piano students come and go, had held grandparents and late-night phone calls, and a small dog named Reggie who barked only at delivery people. It felt like a place where the walls kept confidence without being complicit. You will call the police, Madame said gently. Not because you are certain, because you are frightened. That is reason enough. The officer who arrived a half hour later was named Thaddeus Rook. He was patient and soft-spoken, a man whose posture said he knew the harm that certainty can do when it is wrong. He walked through the house, his pen ready but not eager. He inspected the doors. He glanced at the open spoon drawer, at the notebook by the fridge with its careful notes, then at the single magazine page sealed in a plastic sandwich bag Marin found under the sink. Has anyone else had a key, Miss Wycliffe? Only the realtor, long ago. And the handyman this week, but he was with me the whole time. A friend once watched the place when I first moved in, but she returned the key. I have not given one to anyone else. Thaddeus nodded and wrote in neat print. He crouched by the baseboards and looked for pry marks. He stood at the bathroom and touched the mirror frame, barely moving it, his eyes narrowing in thought. He turned and studied the wall to the right of the tub, where a section of sheetrock, discolored by age, met an older seam. The previous owner did some work back here, he said. See the line? That is newer. Have you ever opened the hollow behind the tub? Many houses this age have a plumbing chase, a space between walls that sometimes runs the entire length of a house. Often they lead to crawl spaces. Sometimes they can be accessed from the basement, sometimes from the attic. Marin felt her stomach tilt. I have not. He followed the wall back into the hallway and measured with his stride, counting off the distance from the bathroom to the far bedroom closet. He opened the closet and leaned his shoulder into the back panel. It gave a fraction of an inch, then held. May I, he said, gesturing to his multi-tool. She nodded, a frightening relief swimming up so quickly her eyes prickled. He cut a clean rectangle along a seam that looked more decorative than structural. When the panel fell forward, dust fanned out and a smell rose up, a mix of cold and old laundry and unwashed skin. Marin's throat clenched against a gag. Thaddeus switched on his flashlight and aimed it into the dark. The beam caught the outline of a narrow space just wide enough for a person to slide through sideways, the vertical ribs of two walls framing a hidden corridor that ran behind the rooms like a secret vein. He angled the beam downward. The floor inside the corridor showed smudges where footsteps had polished dust into an uneven shine. Finger marks scalloped the edges of the opening, the black crescents of grime worked into grooves, shallow shelves had been carved crudely between studs. On them sat two empty water bottles, a single glove, and a small radio without batteries. A half-eaten protein bar lay unwrapped on a rag that might have once been a t-shirt. Marin heard a sound come out of her that she had never made before, a breath that turned into a low moan and then continued, as if she had bent some internal instrument and could not make it stop. Thaddeus glanced back at her and lifted a hand that seemed to settle the air. Let us step outside for a second, he said. He radioed for another unit in a voice as calm as the quiet before a snow. On the porch, the late afternoon had turned the color of pewter. Rain began as a mist that made everything slightly more real. Thaddeus positioned her near the banister and asked gentle questions. Whether there had been thefts in the house or only disturbances, whether she had noticed food missing, whether she had seen anyone lingering in the alley. She thought of the protein bar and realized that yes, a few cans had disappeared from the pantry. A jar of peanuts had felt lighter. Bread gone faster than she could account for. Minus one spoon. Minus a washcloth. Minus a sense of belonging in the place she owned. A second patrol car arrived. Officer Inez Paramo, compact and quick-eyed, joined them. Together, the two officers re-entered the house. Marin hovered at the threshold and then followed a few steps behind because not knowing had become unbearable. The hallway seemed longer now, the floorboards pulled tight with tension, the closet yawned open with its square mouth, the cut panel leaned against the bed like a warning shield. The flashlight beam slid along the corridor and paused on something printed on the wall. A line of calendar pages had been taped up in a column, days crossed out with careful slashes. The months were not current, they were stolen from old mailers, public flyers, a hardware store giveaway. The slashes formed a rhythm, steady until they broke into a stutter across the week of Thanksgiving. Next to one date in that week, someone had written a single word in pencil. Cold. Inez whispered that someone had been living there a while. Thaddeus nodded once. They pressed forward, moving slowly, announcing themselves in clear voices that tilted toward kindness because kindness can keep people from doing desperate things when they are cornered. Tacoma Police. Come out slowly. We are here to help. Do not make any sudden moves. You will not be harmed. Silence. Then a rustle. A scraping inch by inch against wood that sounded like a person trying to become part of shadow. The flashlight beam steadied. A face blinked into view between studs, eyes wide, cheeks gaunt under a scrim of beard. The man wore a black hoodie mottled with drywall dust, and he held one hand up, palm flat, the other hand tucked against his chest, as if protecting something small and breakable. His voice came out hoarse and thin. "Do not blare the light right at me. Please, I will come out. Do not hurt me." Inez softened her tone another degree. "We just want to make sure no one is hurt. Step this way, hands where we can see them. We will talk on the porch." The man squeezed through the opening like a folded map unfurling. He was taller than Marin expected, but bent by close quarters and cold. His shoes were duct-taped at the toes. He looked at the floor, not at her. When he finally lifted his face, his eyes flashed with something that was not defiance. Not quite shame either. Something complicated and wounded that made Marin's own anger hesitate. He said his name was Corin Albee. He did not offer a last fixed address. He said he had come in through a broken basement vent in early autumn when night began to smell sharper and the shelters were full by evening. He said he had chosen her house because of the alley's cover, because the weeds were high, because he thought it was empty after watching the windows for a few days when she had been away visiting a friend in Portland. "I never meant to scare you," he said, voice cracking on scare. "I tried not to touch things. Sometimes I messed up. I am sorry." The officers searched the corridor and found a nest made from thrifted blankets, a flat pillow, a small battery lantern with a cracked lens, a milk crate of scavenged items. In the crate was a paperback from the very library where Marin worked, stamped withdrawn, a slim prayer book from a hospital chapel, 3 postcards bundled with a rubber band, a photo of a pale dog with a black ear. "Did you ever stand over me while I slept?" Marin asked before she knew she was going to speak. The question sounded as if someone else had asked it, using her chest as a drum. Corin flinched as if struck. "No. No, I did not. If I heard you come home, I stayed very still. If I heard you move, I moved away. I am not proud. I did not want to be this person. But it got cold." Thaddeus listened and wrote. Inez remained near the opening, scanning the corridor for anything that might suggest harm, a knife, a stash of pills, a serious plan. They found none. They found instead a journal scribbled in with a pencil worn almost to its metal band. The first page held a simple count of days and meals. The second page contained a list of things to do when the house was empty. Look for leak. Patch draft near tub. Check for mice around pantry. Stop taking food, find work, move on. The handwriting was careful and oddly hopeful. Corin was given a blanket and a bottle of water. He shook uncontrollably. A shiver that seemed to come not just from the temperature, but from the sudden absence of hiding. He kept glancing toward the opening as if part of his mind remained there like a limb not yet aware it had been freed. Thaddeus explained the options in a voice that respected the fact that this was a house and also a crime. There would be trespassing charges and maybe burglary, though the missing items would matter to the charge. There would be resources, a shelter, a counselor, a court date. He explained that the decision to press charges would involve the city, not only the homeowner. He spoke as if measuring each sentence to make sure it sat right in the air. Inez called for transport. The air in the hallway warmed by degrees, as if the house itself were edging back to a balance it understood. In the days that followed, Marin learned more than she expected about the ways people slip through seams. Corin had once worked hanging drywall for a contractor who lost a bid, then another bid, then let his crew go with a shrug and a promise he never kept. Corin had a sister in Spokane who had moved twice in a year and left a forwarding address that forwarded to a mailbox that now belonged to someone else. He had no current ID. He had a softness for small dogs. He could fix copper pipe well enough to keep a sink from singing. She learned these facts slowly because people in uniforms asked questions and people in plain clothes came to the porch and asked if she wanted to give a statement. She gave one, careful and unadorned. She had heard sounds. She had found the hiding place. The officers discovered him. She had not been harmed, though harm had happened in a different way that did not leave marks. The handyman, Llewellyn, returned and sealed the corridor with screws whose heads he painted to match the trim. He adjusted the bathroom mirror so the latch settled with a snug finality. He added a grate to the basement vent that looked like an exclamation mark finally turned into a period. When he finished, he stood with her in the kitchen and poured coffee from a thermos he carried everywhere. The coffee tasted like one strong thing in a week of weak ones. You did everything right, he said, even the frightened part. Fear keeps people cautious. Caution keeps people alive. The neighborhood adjusted too. Madame O'Rourke started leaving her porch light on from dusk to dawn. Earl fixed the motion sensor over Marin's back steps. The woman with the beagle changed her route and passed by more often in the evening, waving with a smile that reached all the way to her eyebrows. Children stopped chalking their initials in the alley and began drawing circles that looked like eyes. Tacoma's rain drummed steady on roofs and gutters and gave the street a sound that was almost clarifying. One afternoon in December of the same year, Marin sat in the library's break room with Inez Paramo, who had stopped by to return a book of poetry she had borrowed months before during an outreach program. They shared a microwave burrito and a bowl of grapes. Inez, out of uniform, looked smaller, younger, and somehow more formidable. She listened as Marin tried to describe the way her house felt now. "It is my place again," Marin said. "But in the night, I sometimes hold my breath and wait for nothing. The waiting is louder than the nothing." Inez nodded in a way that said she believed in the physical reality of fear as much as the fact of drywall and screws. "The mind makes ladders and trapdoors," she said. "It thinks in architecture after it has been inside a house like that. It will quiet." In the following weeks, Corin was arraigned. A public defender named Orrin Vest met with him. The judge listened to the recommendation for a diversion program that included counseling, job placement assistance, and a requirement that he not return to North Sheridan Avenue. The prosecutor did not push for a heavy sentence and noted the absence of violence and the presence of obvious need. The court clerk read out dates that would later become folded papers in thin files. Everyone spoke in the careful tone people use when they know something fragile could be made worse by their own voices. Marin did not attend the hearing. She chose instead to stand in her kitchen at 9 in the morning and twist the mirror latch one more time, a ritual that had the texture of an incantation. She made toast. She watched light find the edge of the counter. She exhaled in a way that allowed her ribs to feel like part of the house and not at odds with it. Later that day, she went for a walk along Ruston Way, where the bay lifted its shoulders under gulls that shouted irreverent laughter into the wind. A barista at a stand near the water remembered her order and did not remark on the fact that she now tipped more generously, as if redistributing luck. That winter brought a sky as pale as porcelain most mornings. Marin developed a new habit. When she came home, she said hello to the house out loud in a voice not for anyone else. Not a prayer. Not a superstition. A statement. I am here. This is mine. You are safe with me, and I am safe with you. On a late Sunday in January of 2020, after the holiday lights had been taken down and the street wore its familiar dimness again, Marin received a letter from a shelter downtown. It was short. It thanked her for cooperating with outreach resources and for speaking with the advocate who called the week after the incident. It said that Corin had entered a program. It said he had asked that the shelter deliver a small envelope to her if she agreed. The advocate had asked, gently, whether she wanted it. She had agreed, and now the envelope sat on her dining room table. She washed her hands, she opened the flap, and slid out a single page folded twice. The handwriting was careful, like the list in the journal. The words were simple. I am sorry. I believe you were kind even when you were frightened. I did wrong. I will try to be better and to be someone you would not be afraid to meet on a street. Thank you for not making me into a ghost. Her throat closed around a feeling she had not named yet. Not forgiveness, not even relief. Something like permission to build a life again, not only a habit of vigilance. She folded the note and slipped it into a recipe book her grandmother had given her long ago, between the pages that described how to simmer broth slowly and how to taste before adding salt. She did not tell many people about the note. It felt like something that would be diminished by more air than it needed. Spring came, as it always does, even when it seems it will not. The maples along the sidewalk lit up with leaves, and the beagle's route expanded back to the park. Marin planted herbs in a window box over the kitchen sink and discovered the way new green smells like electricity. Llewellyn stopped by to show her how to check the attic fan. Madame O'Rourke began teaching a young neighbor scales on an old upright that had not been tuned since her last student left. The street acquired a different music. In the hush of some evenings, there were still noises. Of course there were. A house is a living system of materials, adjusting and forgiving, tightening and releasing, making small negotiations with time and weather. When the sounds came, Marin listened, and then she did what she had practiced. She breathed until the breath was not a task. She named what she heard. Foundation settling, heat moving, rain. She waited until the quiet returned. It usually did. On a deceptively warm afternoon in early May of that year, she found herself cleaning the closet where the panel had once opened into shadow. She had been avoiding it as if it were a cemetery of wood. She pulled everything out, boxes and coats and a pair of shoes that had never quite fit. The back of the closet, patched now and painted over, looked unremarkable. She ran her palm over the new seam. It was smooth, almost too smooth for a house that had lived this long. She pressed her hand there and imagined the corridor on the other side, empty, filled only with the quiet that wood holds like memory. She set a small object on the shelf above, a round stone she had carried in her pocket since the winter. It was not a symbol intended for anyone else. It was the sort of stone you pick up on a walk because it fits the space between thumb and forefinger just right, and because its weight says something trustworthy about gravity. It sat there and did not proclaim anything. It just was. The city moved on because cities must. News cycles folded their own pages and found new ones. But the block knew. The neighbors wove the story into the fabric of the place the way people do, a caution not spoken loudly, a memory held and then set down with care. Sometimes a new postal carrier would pause on the porch, greeted by Madame's formal hello and her instruction to stand taller. Sometimes a bus would breathe at the corner and let off someone who would look up at the row of houses and decide to keep walking. Sometimes the beagle would lift a paw, listening hard to some frequency humans cannot catch, and then he would sneeze and pull his human toward home. Corin did not return to North Sheridan Avenue. Marin did not see him again, though once in a store near the transit center, she noticed someone with a familiar stoop buying a pair of work gloves, and for a second, the world wavered around the edges like heat above pavement. The man turned and was not Corin. Her breath steadied. She bought a packet of screws and went home to tighten the hinge on a kitchen cabinet that had begun to squeak. The hinge quieted. The cabinet closed with a sound that felt honest. By summer, the house had developed a new rhythm that included less dread and more trivial pleasure. Light moved across the wood floors in long stripes. A friend visited and slept in the guest room without waking in the night. Marin read books on the porch and learned to identify the call of a particular crow that liked the fur at the corner. She cooked the cider brine chicken from the torn recipe, not because of the history of the page, but because she had always meant to try it. She brined it overnight in a bowl big enough to whisper ocean. She roasted it until the skin crackled. She ate it at the table alone and then shared leftovers with Madame 2 doors down. They agreed it tasted like something worth repeating. There were still nights when Marin would wake and the house would hesitate. She did not blame the house for this. She did not blame herself. She stood and walked the hallway, not as a guard, but as a person who belongs where she stands. In the bathroom, she touched the mirror latch and listened for the click. She watched her reflection. She looked less haunted than she had feared. She looked like someone who had been afraid and had not lost the ability to be ordinary. On a morning in late September of the following year, after a long walk by the water, she returned to find a letter without a return address. She opened it on the stoop. Inside was a sheet torn from a job intake form. A few lines had been filled out: name, date, position applied for at a warehouse off South Orchard Street. At the bottom, a small note: I have a place now, and a bed. No walls to hide in. Thank you for not turning me into a story that ends with a door slamming. She read it twice. She did not tell anyone. She slid the note into the same recipe book near the other one. She poured herself coffee and sat at the small table by the window and let the day cross its own threshold into being. Outside, the trolley of gulls scissored the sky. Someone down the block started a lawnmower. A bus breathed and then moved on. The house, in its ordinary way, gathered all these sounds and made them into a song that no one would dance to, but most people could live inside. He kept 3 girls captive for 10 years, and no one noticed. The story begins on a cool spring afternoon in Cleveland, Ohio, at a modest 2-story house on Seymour Avenue, not far from the lake where gulls wheel and cry. The porch railings are chipped, the blinds forever tilted, the front door almost always shut. Neighbors pass with grocery bags and stroller wheels clicking over cracked concrete. Music sometimes drifts from inside. A radio tuned to oldies, a drum beat muffled by thick curtains. It is an ordinary street in an ordinary American city, the kind of place where people wave from porches and borrow ladders without signing anything. And yet, behind those tired blinds, 3 young women lived in captivity for a decade while the city moved around them, unaware or unwilling to believe. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Their names are Amanda Berry, Michelle Knight, and Georgina Gina DeJesus. They were taken in the early 2000s over the span of a few springs and summers that should have carried them into first jobs and first apartments. Instead, their paths converged in a small set of rooms, a maze of improvised locks and chains, a radio that was loud when the captor wished, silent when he did not, and the constant rasp of fear. The man who took them, a former school bus driver named Ariel Castro, knew the neighborhood well. He knew which streets emptied at the end of the school day, which families hurried, which porches sagged. He knew how to look like a neighbor and not a menace, how to nod and keep walking. Michelle Knight disappeared first, in the late summer of 2002. She was small, tough, and older than the other girls would be when they vanished. She had been trying to reclaim parts of her life the world had made hard for her. On the day she was taken, she expected an ordinary errand near West 65th. The sky was a dull pewter, with a little wind moving wrappers along the curb. A familiar car slowed beside her, the driver leaning across the seat with the easy voice of someone she had seen around. He offered a ride, a few minutes, a quick stop, and then home. She hesitated. She wanted to believe in the shortcut life rarely offers. She got in. The click of the door was light. The meaning was heavy. When the car turned towards Seymour Avenue, she did not know she had crossed a border she would not step back across for many years. The second disappearance came the following spring, in 2003, when Amanda Berry finished a shift at a burger restaurant on Lorraine Avenue and started the walk that was supposed to end at her front door. It was a day with the kind of light that makes a city look honest. She called her sister on a payphone, a voice quick with plans for cake and a birthday that was coming the next day. Then the same familiar car, the same friendly wave. The man said he knew her sister, said he could take her home faster, said all the little things that stitch a stranger into a pattern of safety. She trusted the pattern just long enough. The car door shut. Music on the radio played a song everyone knew, upbeat and harmless, and the sidewalk slipped by. The third girl, Gina DeJesus, was 13 when she disappeared in the spring of 2004. She was walking home from school with a friend, secondhand chatter fluttering around them like sparrows. In a moment that still makes the air go thin when you think about it, Gina and her friend split at a corner that should have been nothing more than a corner. The car stopped again, the same driver, the same casual acquaintance language, the same promise of a short ride. She stepped into the illusion of ordinary kindness. The door shut. The city continued, unaware that another family would soon be taping flyers to telephone poles and asking questions that felt like prayers. Inside the house on Seymour Avenue, the world became small. Windows were covered, doors groaned with extra locks, hallways narrowed with stored junk and deliberate clutter, the better to slow a sudden flight. Rooms were repurposed into cells. Music from an upstairs radio sometimes blared through the floorboards when the captor wanted to drown out their voices or his own thoughts. At night, the furnace clicked and sighed, and sometimes a neighbor's dog barked, then fell quiet again. The smell of old carpet, fried food, motor oil, and dust saturated the air. The women learned to map time by the way sunlight found seams in the blinds, by the scent of winter's first radiator heat, by the creak of steps that meant he was coming. There were rules. Do this, not that. Speak only when spoken to. Step here, not there. Punishments were swift, the logic always shifting, so that safety could never settle. He starved them or fed them on a whim, bought them fast food, and then withheld the next meal for days, as if kindness had to be balanced by cruelty. He sometimes gave them gifts, little objects that carried poison under their ribbon, a new shirt, a cheap necklace, a used television, a coloring book, a winter hat. He forced them to watch the news when reports of their own disappearances flickered across the screen, then shut it off with a satisfied sigh when the story moved on to weather and sports. He called them by names he chose, wrote the rules, erased them, wrote them again. Families searched, flyers went up and came down in rain and snow and went up again. Candlelight vigils lit the fronts of stores and churches. Tips poured in, hot with hope, then cooled. Amanda's mother, whose determination could have bent steel, went on television, pleaded with anyone who might know anything to come forward. She died before her daughter came home. Gina's parents stood beside clergy and police, their voices steady even when their hands shook. Michelle's name did not make as many headlines. She had been pushed to the edges of the city's attention even before she vanished. But she was loved, and those who loved her kept asking. The seasons turned. Years became a dull loop. Police chased leads that turned to fog. Some neighbors noticed a boarded window and thought little of it. Others saw the man carrying heavy bags into the house at odd hours and shrugged because people carry strange burdens all the time. There were close calls. The front door stood open for a moment. The screen latched, but the spring weak. A neighbor stopped by to talk about a car, a drum kit, a broken taillight. Footsteps approached the porch and paused. Inside, a television was turned up to cover the sound of breathing. Once a child's toy was seen in the yard. Someone asked about it. The captor said a niece had visited. Smiles, a little wave, the porch conversation ended. The door closed, locks clicked. In the house, the women found a way to hold on to themselves. They whispered to one another when they could. They passed notes when they could not speak. They learned the rhythms of the captor's job and the gaps those rhythms might grant. They invented small rituals to remind their minds that time still existed and belonged to them too. On birthdays, they whispered the date to themselves and let a single memory bloom. A slice of cake, a tiny gift, a swing in a park, a hand squeeze. They taught and retaught each other the shape of courage. They promised to remember their true names. One spring, hope changed shape. Amanda, whose voice had remained steady in the worst storms, had a child in that house, a little girl with quick eyes and soft hair. The captor claimed paternity. The truth was a testament to survival. The women shielded the child with everything they had. The house became a school. They taught the girl letters with penciled notes, songs hummed softly, stories told in whispers. They showed her which boards creaked and which ones sang. They taught her the difference between ordinary and danger by the smallest signals, the sound of keys tossed on a table, the scrape of a chair. The girl grew up knowing that a window could be a wall, but that a wall could be imagined as a window. When the radio played a song that sounded like freedom, she swayed in place and watched the curtains lift a little in the summer heat. The seasons kept turning, the city grew and eroded and grew again. Houses were painted, then left to peel, the bus routes shifted. On Seymour Avenue, there were years when little changed. Then a sudden new porch column, then nothing. People move through a city like water through a net. They catch on some threads and not others. Ariel Castro kept slipping through. In early May of 2013, a series of slight decisions aligned. The captor left the front of the house less secure than usual. Perhaps he was arrogant, perhaps he was distracted. Perhaps the old screen door did not catch the way it used to. Inside, the air felt different, as if the house itself were about to exhale. Amanda reached for the door and felt it give more than it ever had. Her heart hammered a warning and an invitation. She looked at the child and knew that waiting was another kind of danger. She whispered, and the whisper felt like a vow. She pushed. The door resisted, then shifted. She pushed again with a strength that had been hoarded for years and kept ready for one exact moment. The wood cracked. The chain complained. She screamed then, a sound that climbed the stairs and went out into the street, a sound that used her voice and also every voice that had been kept small. A neighbor heard. His first instinct was disbelief, then confusion, then action. He came forward, tried to kick, tried to lift, tried to pull. The door gave more. The city might have heard the hinge groan. The opening became a gap big enough for a face, then a shoulder, then a body. Amanda slipped out, a child in her arms, a decade traveling behind her like a storm cloud that had finally found a seam in the sky. She ran to a phone and called for help, and when the operator asked for a name, she said her own, as if signing back into existence. The street tilted toward the possibility of rescue. Sirens soon braided through the neighborhood air. Police moved through the house and found Gina and Michelle. The officers called their names, and the names echoed, then landed. There were tears and shouting and relief so intense it bordered on pain. The three survivors emerged into the kind of daylight that stuns the eyes. Neighbors cried, reporters began to gather. Strangers found themselves pressing hands over mouths or against chests as if to hold a heart in place. Family members ran and then slowed and then reached. The city felt for a moment as if it were breathing together, in and out, slow and grateful. The arrest was swift. The man who had walked that street for years with a bag of groceries and a flat expression was taken downtown in handcuffs. The house was sealed. The blinds that had been tilted closed for so long would soon be lifted, and the rooms would give up their secrets. In the days that followed, crowds pressed against police tape and stared at a front door that had finally swung wide. Reporters read lists of items recovered inside. The city grew angrier and sadder by the hour. Some neighbors wondered aloud how they had missed it. Others said they had always thought the house felt wrong, but did not know what to do with a feeling. People brought flowers to a block that had never asked for flowers. The legal process moved with a speed that surprised even those used to courts and calendars. In late summer of 2013, after indictments stacked high with counts that measured only the smallest part of the harm, Ariel Castro stood in a courtroom whose air felt both heavy and precise. He pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. The judge pronounced a sentence so long it needed extra language to hold it, life without parole, plus enough additional years to swallow any fantasy of return. The gavel sounded like a door being closed the right way at last. In that same season, the house on Seymour Avenue was demolished. On the day the heavy machines rolled up, the crowd gathered again. Some came to witness justice of a physical kind, the erasure of a building that had lived as a wound. Others came because they needed to see the structure end in order to believe the story had changed shape. The excavator's claw took the first bite, wood splintered, glass broke into small clean sounds, and the sun struck new angles where walls had stood. A neighbor signaled the start by handing Amanda a lever, and when she engaged the mechanism that began the teardown, she was applauded. Not because demolition is beautiful, but because it can be an act of mercy. Dust rose, then settled. In place of a prison, there was open air. In the months that followed, the survivors did what survivors do. They sought care, then quiet, then the exact mix of speaking and silence each of them needed. They wrote or waited to write. They went to appointments that measured health in numbers and in softer measures like sleep. They re-entered rooms where people said welcome and meant it. They showed extraordinary grace in the face of relentless attention and, inevitably, uneven compassion from a world that both aches for stories like this and sometimes consumes them too quickly. Michelle published a memoir and later another, her words sharp and generous, tracing the way a life can be rebuilt from the inside out. Gina and Amanda told their story together and then stewarded a foundation to help other families who wake in the night with the same terror they once endured. The little girl grew up in a different house where doors are doors. She learned that a street can hold both danger and rescue, and that the sound of sirens can mean help is coming. The city learned more slowly. People argued about what anyone should have noticed, whether a neighbor should have pushed harder against intuition, whether the small signs were small enough to excuse a collective failure. The arguments mattered. They also could not undo what had happened. What could be done was to make new habits, to listen longer, to ask twice, to check on the quiet house with the uneven blinds, to take a feeling seriously even when it arrives without proof. As for the man who caused the harm, he entered a state prison and lasted only a short time before he died by his own hand. The story of that ending is not the story that matters most. The legal record closed. The moral record had been written already by a decade of suffering and resilience. The city did not hold a vigil for him. The women did not need to speak his name. Years later, the block on Seymour Avenue looks like many American blocks rebounding from hard times. There is a patch of grass where the house stood, and sometimes wind moves through it in a way that sounds almost like breath. Children pass on scooters, dogs tug at leashes. The mail carrier stops and jokes with a resident leaning on a railing that has been repainted. Life makes its small repairs. The neighbors know the story, newcomers learn it. The memory does not own the street, but it is part of its map. If you walk Cleveland in the late afternoon, when the sun climbs down the sides of buildings and the air smells faintly of iron and lake water, you might pass by and pause, not in morbid curiosity, but in respect. You might think of a city that failed and then tried to make amends, of families that refused to surrender memory, of three young women who endured something no one should endure, and who, when a seam finally opened, ran through it and let each other out. You might hear traffic on Lorraine, someone singing two houses down, a screen door slamming, a crow scolding from a wire. Ordinary sounds, blessedly ordinary. The title of this account asks a question that still stings. How could he keep three girls captive for 10 years and no one noticed? Part of the answer is that people did notice fragments and could not assemble them. Part is that poverty and neglect can hide both predator and prey in the same shabbiness. Part is that we prefer a tidy world. Another part is that the captor understood how to wear the mask of normal. The final part is this: noticing is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as acting. The lesson Cleveland learned the hard way is that we must build a culture where all three happen in sequence and with care. There is no ribbon tied neatly at the end of a story like this. There is only a closed door torn from its hinges and replaced by open sky, a city that wrote a promise to its citizens in dust and sunlight, survivors who continue making futures one brave choice at a time, and a community that learned to listen with its eyes as well as its ears. The question remains, but so does the answer you can hear in the steady cadence of their names. Amanda Berry, Michelle Knight, Georgina Gina De Jesus. They were here all along. They are here now. The rest of us must be worthy of that truth, and the street must stay bright enough and the doors must stay open enough that when someone whispers for help again, the whole neighborhood hears and moves. She faked her own kidnapping and fooled everyone. On a warm Thursday night in mid-July, the kind of southern evening where the air hangs sweet and heavy above the pines, a 25-year-old nursing student named Carlethia Carly Nicole Russell left work in Birmingham and drove south toward Hoover. Traffic thinned along the long, curving lanes of Interstate 459. It was after 9, the sky dimming from bruised purple to black, and the low hum of tires on asphalt felt like a lullaby meant for people who had finally clocked out. At 9:40-something, Carly dialed 911. Her voice was quick, urgent, as she told the dispatcher she had seen something that should not be there. A toddler, small and alone, wandering near the guardrail on the shoulder of the interstate. She kept talking while she put her hazard lights on. She told the dispatcher she was stopping. She told a family member on another line what she had seen. She described a tiny figure beside the sweeping rush of headlights, the danger, the need to act. Then the call went quiet. The line stayed open just long enough to suggest movement, footsteps, a sudden intake of breath, the strange chorus of engines whipping past, and then a muffled silence that made everything feel wrong. Minutes later, officers found her car near the tree line, just off the southbound lanes, hazard lights still flashing. On the road, they found a cell phone, a purse with an Apple Watch inside, a wig. No one could find Carly. The next hours stretched like wire. Night settled into early morning, and the interstate turned into a search corridor. People in reflective vests paced the grass with flashlights, their beams sliding over weeds and broken bottles. Patrol cars idled on the shoulder with their light bars rotating in steady, hypnotic sweeps. State agencies were notified, the community gathered online and in parking lots. When the sun rose on Friday, it lit a broad swath of suburbia that had suddenly learned the stomach-dropping word missing. By Friday afternoon, Hoover's police chief, Nick Durzis, stood behind a podium and tried to thread the needle between caution and urgency. Reported abduction. Reported toddler. The department was in contact with federal partners. The public was asked for tips. There was no evidence of a child on the shoulder, but there was the call, the car, the items left behind, the young woman gone. The story caught fire. A young woman on her way home. A child in danger. A sudden absence. It had the rhythm of nightmare. Strangers wrote messages of hope. Local businesses offered rewards. Volunteers stapled flyers to telephone poles and tacked them on corkboards in coffee shops. The edges of the paper curled in the humidity, while people pointed at the smiling photo and spoke in lowered voices. Elsewhere, detectives began tugging at threads. They laid out a minute-by-minute timeline from the second she left her job to the second her voice faded from the 911 tape. They pulled camera footage, they emptied the trunk, they got warrants, they sat in front of screens and looked at a history of searches that made their shoulders go tight, Amber Alerts, how old to qualify for one. The Birmingham bus station. One-way bus tickets to Nashville. The plot of the film Taken. What happens in a kidnapping. How to steal without being caught. The queries were not proof on their own, but they were the kind of clues that changed the temperature in an interview room. Saturday evening, after roughly 2 days that felt like 2 years to the people who loved her, Carly came home. She walked through the front door, and the house erupted into relief. She said she had been abducted. She said she had been forced into a car by a man and a woman, then kept out of sight. She said she had escaped. She was taken for medical evaluation. The community exhaled in gratitude and confusion. In the quiet that follows a miracle, investigators watched the pieces fail to lock together. No child was reported missing in that corridor. Traffic cameras did not show a tiny figure. No motorists had dialed in a sighting. The shoulder where she said she stopped had no marks of a struggle, no signs anyone had scrambled through the brush, and the only items recovered were the ones she left. The more she talked, the more the story frayed under the steady pressure of questions. Days later, the same chief returned to the microphones with a statement from her attorney. There was no kidnapping on Thursday, the 13th of July, in the year 2023. She had not seen a toddler on the side of the interstate. What began with a phone call and a missing car had become a hoax that had pulled in loved ones, strangers, city workers, and federal agents. The apology named the people she had frightened and the resources she had consumed. It was clear, it was painful, it was public. The search's aftermath was quieter than the frenzy that fueled it. Officers logged overtime, volunteers folded tables, and drove home. The interstate kept hurrying people past the exit where the hazard lights had once blinked. Over the next weeks and months, court dates replaced search parties. The first hearings were held in the municipal building, under the bright, humming lights that make every bench look the same and every hallway feel colder than it should. Reporters whispered about possible sentences. Lawmakers talked about penalties for false reports. The faces at the defense table changed expression by degrees you only notice if you have spent time on those benches. The most gripping thing, in the end, was not the twist of deception, but the ordinariness of the consequences. A young woman stood before a judge in the Bessemer Division of the Circuit Court. She admitted she had lied. The judge spoke in a voice without theatrics, laying out the penalty with the steadiness people expect from the bench: supervised probation for a year, community service, continued mental health counseling. Restitution that read like a ledger of everyone who stood under floodlights and knocked on doors in the thick night air and hoped for the best. The amount was exact down to the cents because the hours were exact, and the fuel and the paperwork and the overtime lines printed on pay stubs. The order would follow her until it was paid. You could watch the long tail of the story in the small details. On a weekday, months after the plea, a clerk rolled a cart of files into a courtroom that smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. The docket moved, her name was called, a lawyer updated the court on payments, another status date was set. Outside, on the courthouse steps, people in suits moved from shadow to sun and back again, while a local camera crew adjusted a tripod and tried to catch 15 seconds of footage that captured the whole thing. Across town, someone stood at a service counter and signed a sheet before heading out to pick up trash along the edge of a park, a bright vest over a t-shirt, earbuds tucked in, a bag in one hand, a mechanical claw in the other. A supervisor initialed the box when the shift ended. If you go back to the night where everything began, you can still feel the feeling that made so many strangers act. The imagined danger of a child on the shoulder of a busy interstate is a powerful, visceral thing. People share that instinct to swerve, to shield, to intervene. That same impulse carries fundraisers and volunteer lines and candlelight vigils, all those tender, stubborn rituals a community falls into when someone it barely knows suddenly needs everyone. The human mind also seeks patterns, explanations, a story that makes awful sense. It was tempting to paint Carly as an easy villain or as a symbol, a headline instead of a person. But there was no supervillain lurking beyond the guardrail, and there was no neat parable here, only choices and their ripples. She did something reckless and untrue that cost people time and hope. She said she was sorry. The court system answered in a way that kept the doors of a jail closed and the doors of a counseling office open. The city kept the receipt. For families who posted her photo and paced their kitchens with phones in their hands, there was a bruise of betrayal that faded slowly. For the dispatchers and patrol officers and detectives, there was another case file with a different kind of ending. For the rest of us, it was a reminder that even a lie can summon the very best parts of a community, which is precisely why it feels so heavy after the truth arrives. The highway still runs past Hoover, smooth and bright under the floodlights. On some nights, the sky is so clean and clear you can see the blue glow of dashboard screens from a bridge as cars slide beneath you. On other nights, rain hammers the lanes until the shoulder looks like a narrow river. People make their calls. They say what they have seen or think they have seen, and the voice on the other end keeps them calm while help heads that way. Somewhere, a dispatcher hangs up, writes a time in the margin, and listens for the next ring. There is no mystery left to solve in this story, and there is nothing to wait for. What began with the kind of plea that makes people pull over and look around ended with a record that says plainly what happened. A phone call, a lie, 2 days of fear, an apology, probation, community service, counseling, restitution that gets chipped away month by month, like a slow debt to a town that showed up when called. The lesson is not that people should stop looking out for one another. The lesson is that truth matters most when the stakes are highest, and that a community's faith is a living thing that deserves care. The summer night has long since dissolved into other seasons. The headline has moved down the page, the interstate hums, and if you stand on the shoulder where the hazard lights flashed and listen, you will hear only wind and tire noise and the rush of air across guardrails. No voices, no panic, no miracle return at the front door. Just the ordinary life of a place that answered a call, learned the truth, and went back to work. He pretended to be a Rockefeller and got away with murder. The story begins not in the skyscrapers of New York or the white mansions of Boston, but in a small town in Bavaria, West Germany, during the early 1960s. In a quiet community, among rolling fields and narrow streets, a boy named Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter was born in February of 1961. His parents were ordinary people, living without wealth or privilege. Yet from his earliest years, Christian displayed an unusual hunger for reinvention. He was restless in the life he had been given and longed for something bigger, grander, something that would take him across the ocean and into the heart of America. By his late teenage years, Christian became fixated on the idea of leaving Germany behind. In 1978, at just 17 years old, he managed to secure a student visa and traveled to the United States. When he landed, he carried with him not just a suitcase, but also an ambition that would shape the rest of his life. He did not want to be Christian, the son of modest parents from Bavaria. He wanted to become someone else, someone important, someone with status. This was the beginning of a lifelong deception. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, he wandered across different states. He enrolled briefly in community college classes, he stayed with host families, and he tried different names. At one point, he called himself Christopher Chichester, an English aristocrat with a hint of mystery. He introduced himself to wealthy families in San Marino, California, an affluent community northeast of Los Angeles, and quickly began to charm his way into their circles. His accent, his mannerisms, his fabricated tales of noble ancestry all made him appear eccentric, but in a way that appealed to certain people who were drawn to the exotic. He wore tailored jackets, spoke of film projects, and claimed to be descended from European royalty. It was all a performance, but one that was convincing enough for him to gain access to homes, dinner parties, and opportunities that would otherwise have been out of reach. It was in San Marino, during the early 1980s, that Christian crossed paths with a young couple named John and Linda Sohus. They lived in a modest home on Lorraine Road, not far from where Christian, calling himself Chichester, had taken up residence with a local family who had allowed him to rent their guest house. Neighbors thought he was peculiar, but not dangerous. He spoke of connections to Hollywood, of plans to travel, and of friends in high places. What they did not know was that behind his polite smile lay something far darker. In the winter of 1985, John and Linda suddenly vanished. They told friends they might be leaving for a job opportunity on the East Coast, perhaps even abroad. After that, no one saw them again. Christian, the supposed English nobleman living next door, gave vague answers when asked. He hinted they had been recruited for secret government work. He dismissed questions with a casual wave. Months passed, and then years with no clear answers. The Sohus family grieved, neighbors whispered, and suspicion lingered, but there was no proof, no bodies, no clear trail. Then, in the backyard of their San Marino home, construction workers later unearthed human remains. It was John Sohus. Linda's body was never found. The tenant, Christopher Chichester, soon disappeared as well. He slipped out of California, and with him vanished the truth. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Christian's deception only grew bolder. He cycled through names from Christopher Mountbatten to Christopher Crow, posing as a Wall Street broker in New York. He claimed to have insider ties to high finance, to television, to the upper reaches of society. But perhaps his most audacious transformation came when he began to call himself Clark Rockefeller. With that single choice, he attached himself to one of the most powerful names in American history. To those who met him, he was Clark, the eccentric but brilliant descendant of oil baron John D. Rockefeller. He told stories of family estates, of yachts, of old money traditions. He dressed in preppy fashion, walked small dogs through Manhattan, and avoided questions with a mix of arrogance and charm. People believed him, or at least enough of them did to let him pass. In the mid-1990s, in New York, he met a successful businesswoman named Sandra Boss. She was intelligent, a Harvard graduate, and a partner at a prestigious consulting firm. Yet even she was drawn in by Clark's charm and by the aura of old money that surrounded him. They married in 1995, and for years, she accepted his identity without question. Together, they lived in high society, attending galas and dinners, with Clark spinning elaborate tales of family connections. He isolated her, discouraged her from inviting his so-called relatives into their lives, and maintained strict control over their world. In 2001, they had a daughter, whom he adored in his own obsessive way. To outsiders, they looked like a wealthy, if somewhat unusual, couple. Behind the facade, Sandra was enduring manipulation, secrecy, and increasing unease. By 2007, the marriage collapsed. Sandra filed for divorce, and in the process, the carefully constructed mask of Clark Rockefeller began to slip. Investigators and lawyers tried to verify his family ties, his supposed wealth, his claimed lineage. Nothing checked out. There were no birth records, no legitimate Rockefeller relatives who recognized him, no evidence that he was who he claimed. Still, Clark clung to the identity, refusing to let go of the fiction that had carried him for decades. Then, in the summer of 2008, during a supervised visit with his daughter in Boston, he staged a shocking act. As the social worker looked away, Clark forced his daughter into a waiting car and disappeared. It was a desperate act of abduction, an attempt to keep control of the only family bond he had left. The FBI launched a nationwide search For days, headlines blared with the story of the fake Rockefeller who had kidnapped his own child. Authorities traced him to Baltimore, Maryland, where he was living under yet another false name in a rented apartment. He was arrested, his daughter safely returned to her mother. At last, the web of lies began to unravel. As investigators dug deeper, the truth emerged. Clark Rockefeller was not a Rockefeller at all. He was Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter from Bavaria, a man who had spent 3 decades weaving false identities across America. His history of deception stretched back to California, where the disappearance of John and Linda Sohus in 1985 had remained unsolved. Now, with Christian in custody, the case was reopened. Forensic evidence linked him to the remains buried in the San Marino backyard. Witnesses recalled the strange tenant, the English accent, the sudden disappearance. Piece by piece, prosecutors built their case. In 2013, nearly 3 decades after the crime, Christian Gerhardsreiter was convicted of murdering John Sohus. The jury deliberated on the evidence, the buried bones, the inconsistencies in his story, and returned a verdict of guilty. He was sentenced to prison for 27 years to life. As for Linda, her body has never been found. Her fate remains a haunting mystery, a silence that no courtroom testimony could fill. The story of Christian Gerhardsreiter is more than just the tale of a con man. It is a reflection on how easily appearances can deceive, how wealth and status can blind even the sharpest minds. He moved through American society with confidence, exploiting the trust of strangers, the politeness of neighbors, the curiosity of friends. He wore disguises not of costume, but of personality, reinventing himself with each new city. He killed when it suited him, and for decades he evaded justice, hiding behind names that were never his own. Today, he sits in a California prison, his days of preppy suits and high society dinners long gone. His daughter, now grown, lives with the legacy of a father who was never who he claimed to be. The Rockefeller name, once borrowed and tarnished by his lies, remains a reminder of how far one man was willing to go to escape his ordinary beginnings. From Bavaria to Boston, from San Marino to Manhattan, his trail of deception is finally over. Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up, because this one's a doozy. Delivered in the style you love, true crime, wrapped in eerie details with a twist that'll leave you questioning everything. This is the story of the Forbidden House Mystery. It's a tale from a quiet town in rural Ohio where something unspeakable happened in a house that locals swore was cursed. So let's dive in, but fair warning, you might want to leave the lights on for this one. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? Kidnapped at 11, found 18 years later in her kidnapper's backyard. On a cool morning in early June of 1991, in the pine-threaded quiet of South Lake Tahoe, an 11-year-old girl named J.C. Lee Dugard walked toward the corner where the yellow school bus usually chuffed to a stop. The light was thin and silver, the kind that makes even the road look like it has been polished overnight by wind. She wore a pink jacket against the mountain air, hugged her books to her chest, and listened to the hush of the neighborhood waking up. Somewhere, a screen door clicked. A dog barked once. A car turned the corner and slowed. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? It was the kind of car that looked ordinary until it did not. A gray sedan idling too close to the curb, its engine a low murmur. JC stood on the gravel's edge, biting her lip, pretending not to notice how the passenger window inched downward. The man in the driver's seat had the practiced smile of a stranger who has decided not to be a stranger. The woman beside him leaned forward just as the car crept parallel to the child. "Hi there," the man said, his voice casual, a beat too bright. He asked for directions, something about a street name that did not exist, a question that was never meant to be answered. The woman's eyes flicked to the side mirror. The man's hand moved. The door swung. The world lurched. There was a sudden spray of gravel, a hand like a clamp on JC's wrist. The breath knocked from her chest as she stumbled and fell forward into the car. A stun tightened her limbs, and then a thudding, blank quiet, the smell of upholstery and cigarettes, and the sound of the door slamming like a verdict. The car rolled away, slow at first, then fast, the bus stop shrinking behind them, the road unspooling in a ruthless line. By late morning, sirens stitched across Tahoe's blue bowl of sky. Deputies fanned out through neighborhoods, neighbors stepped onto porches and shaded their eyes. JC's mother, Terry, was called at work and arrived with her heart already sprinting. A marathon of questions that had no ankles, no knees, nothing to stand on. The pink jacket was nowhere. The sidewalk held only an impression of small shoes. The day felt misprinted, like a calendar had been stamped wrong, and no one knew how to fix it. The car with JC in its back seat climbed out of the mountains and down through the Central Valley. Heat clung to the windows. The couple in the front were nearly silent, as if they were transporting glass. They were Philip Garrido and his wife, Nancy, names that would become a kind of echo in the years ahead. Hours later, the sedan turned into the dull hush of an Antioch cul-de-sac, then down a driveway toward a nondescript single-story house at the end of a street that seemed to forget it was supposed to end somewhere. Beyond the fence, hidden from the view of neighbors and passers-by, stretched a backyard no one really saw. Behind the main house, across a patchwork of weeds and broken concrete, behind a second rattling fence and another gate, there was a maze of sheds, tarps, tents, and a soundproofed outbuilding. It was a place of blind corners and jury-rigged doors, a place constructed to confuse the sky. Philip led JC across the crunchy grass and into the hidden yard, through a gate that complained on its hinges, under a tarp that breathed in the breeze, and finally into a room that swallowed sound. The door shut, the dim light blinked. He told her she would be safe if she did as she was told. He told her this was temporary. He told her things that sounded like comfort but felt like locks. The air was stale. She could hear her own breathing. In South Lake Tahoe, the search became a map of grief. Flyers multiplied on telephone poles. The photo of a blonde 11-year-old with clear eyes and a shy smile was taped into windows and pinned to corkboards in grocery stores from State Line to Placerville. Volunteers combed creek beds, abandoned lots, edges of trailheads, anywhere a mystery might choose to hide. The school bus driver was questioned again and again. The woman at the corner house replayed her morning coffee over and over, searching her memory for a detail that might turn into a door. Leads arrived thin and loud and then went quiet. The day rolled into the next. Summer burned into fall. The calendar turned its pages even when no one wanted it to. For JC, time reduced itself to a sequence of small survivals. The morning was a small survival. The noon hour was a small survival. The way the sunlight leaked through the seam of a tarp and crawled in a slow square across the plywood floor was a small survival. She learned the sounds of the yard the way a person learns a language. The swallow of the hot water heater, the rasp of a rake on gravel, the hollow knock of Philip's footsteps versus the lighter step of Nancy, whose presence was a weather that changed without warning. When Philip disappeared into the main house or ran errands in town, a different kind of air filled the room. JC counted and recounted the seconds between those footsteps, counted until counting felt like a promise. Philip talked to her as if she were both audience and captive wind. He talked about a God he believed was directing his every step, about voices he thought were guiding him. He paced, he jotted in notebooks. He played music to the empty backyard as if the air needed to hear it. He told her he had changed. He told her she would help him become good. There were days when he made vows to invisible witnesses, vows that crumbled with the dusk, vows that got replaced by locks and instructions and threats. There were nights when the sky stretched over the backyard and pooled blue-black on the tarps, and there was no sound at all except crickets and the far hush of traffic on a road she could not see. In the outside world, Terry refused to let her daughter's name become a past tense. She stood at vigils where candlelight trembled in paper cups. She answered calls from strangers who whispered hints they could not verify, callers who insisted they had seen a girl who looked like JC in a grocery store aisle 3 counties away. She met with detectives, learned their careful language, felt the slow arithmetic of a cold case tug at the edges of her resolve. On the anniversaries, she brought flowers, she spoke into microphones, she stared down the collected lenses of TV cameras, and begged anyone listening to keep the phone lines open, to keep their eyes open, to keep hope stubborn and loud. Back in the Antioch backyard, seasons turned. The hidden yard baked in summer, each tarp a heat trap, the sheds simmering with the afternoon. In winter, rain drummed and pooled, leaked along seams, dampened the blankets until they carried the smell of wet canvas and mildew. Years were learned by the ways the light shifted through new tiers in the tarps. The world beyond the fence evolved like a rumor. JC grew older. She passed the birthdays by tracing the old one in her mind, then the next, then the next. The old clothes no longer fit. Her voice adjusted to itself. She learned to keep part of herself folded away like a note no one else would read. When she was a young teenager, the backyard arrangement metastasized. There were more structures, more wires, more pathways that led nowhere. Philip built a tiny improvised world that operated by rules only he understood. A world that pretended to be order but smelled like fear. He spoke of redemption and then demanded obedience. He prayed out loud and then reset the locks. He promised daylight and then designed new shadows. In time, two small girls were born in that backyard. JC learned to mother inside a space that had no horizon, learned to make games from what she could reach, learned to read the sky like a clock because the calendar felt like a rumor. Their laughter sounded startling and wild, like birds that had found their way into a cavern and decided to sing anyway. There were neighbors, of course, in Antioch, as there almost always are. They noticed oddities the way people notice them, with curiosity that thins into shrugs when there is no clean answer. A gate that stayed locked even on easy afternoons. A man who talked to himself and to no one in particular, who sometimes played music too loud and then apologized with a smile that looked like a paper cut. Calls were made once, twice, the kind of calls that fall into a bureaucratic maze and come out the other side with a note. Life went on, mail was delivered, lawns were mowed and not mowed, people waved and then went inside. Years layered themselves one upon another until the backyard felt like a country where clocks were merely decorations. Yet, on a late August day in 2009, inside the leafy calm of the University of California's Berkeley campus, something finally tilted. Philip arrived with the two girls, now school age, leading them as if he were their guardian, which he was not, and yet in that moment, he played the part with a confidence that looked like certainty. He wanted a permit for an event that had the scrim of religious purpose. He spoke with an officer who listened longer than the man expected, and while listening, this officer noticed the girls' eyes and their insufficient answers, noticed how their words seemed borrowed, noticed the way Philip talked over truths that should have been simple. That thin thread of suspicion grew. The officer made a call, another campus officer leaned in. A parole agent, who had known Philip on paper and in scheduled visits, pulled those papers off the shelf and fanned them like a hand of suddenly dangerous cards. Someone asked Philip to come in. He returned to his hidden house, collected the women and the girls, and then drove back to the parole office as if the story he had told himself could stand up in the light. He believed in his invention. He believed in the labyrinth he had kept. He did not understand yet that the doors would open anyway. At the parole office, the light was sterile and equal, the kind that does not cave to performances. The conversations forked and turned. Names were offered and then corrected, then offered again. Simple questions were asked, and those simple questions made the room feel complicated. JC's heart was a runaway horse in that room. She had learned the art of caution to a degree most adults never have to consider, yet something in the air changed, something she could feel even as she clutched the hands of the two girls. A sympathetic voice coaxed, not a command, but a path. A detective stepped close, a woman with steady eyes and a tone built to be believed. Who are you? Not who he says you are. Not who you have been made to be. Who are you? JC had spent nearly 2 decades without her own name spoken to her in a room that was safe. She had practiced her real name silently in the dark once, then stopped, because language could be dangerous in a place that weaponized attention. In the parole office, her voice went first to a whisper. Then it rose. My name is JC. The syllables felt both new and ancient in her mouth. The room inhaled. The parole agent stepped out into a short corridor and made a phone call that hit like a bell. Shortly afterward, the detective placed another call, this one to South Lake Tahoe. On the receiving end, a department that had carried a case for 18 years paused. The afternoon there was warm, the air thin and precise, and then the voice on the line said a name that had become, for many, a memorial. "We think we have her. We need you to come." By evening, the Antioch property was strung with tape and lantern light, the quiet of the cul-de-sac shattered by radios and the careful footfalls of law enforcement. The backyard, that stash of makeshift rooms and weathered tarps, was transformed into a scene that had to be read like a book whose chapters had been intentionally scrambled. Officers moved through the maze with slow purpose, measuring the distances between doors that had never opened to outsiders and noting the ways the structures intersected, which made no sense to anyone who valued daylight. Evidence technicians spoke in low voices, called out to each other with single words, logged what could be logged. They cataloged not just objects, but the architecture of control. In a separate room, JC sat with her daughters, the fluorescent light softening in the evening. She held their hands, answered their questions quietly, and tried to stitch together a way to explain a world that was finally beginning to expand. She tasted the idea of tomorrow and found it strange and too bright, but the strangeness did not scare her. It felt like a cliff with a rail and a view. When she was asked if there was someone she wanted to call, her breath faltered. A phone appeared. Numbers were dialed. The ring went through deep space, through years that suddenly felt stackable, and landed in a house where a mother had never moved out of the reach of hope. Terry picked up and said hello, a word she had said a million times, yet this time it trembled like a bell being struck. The voice on the other end was thin and winded, the voice of a person who had been walking a long time and had finally stopped. "Mom." The room seemed to tilt. The sky outside her window seemed to listen. Then the rest of the sentence came, threaded with disbelief and something stronger than relief. "It is me." There are reunions that are filmed and end up being watched by people who need proof that gravity is not the only law that holds. There are reunions that happen behind closed doors and remain private, quiet as a hand sliding across a table to find another hand. The reunion between JC and her mother was their own, edged by cameras and microphones, yes, but also protected by the choice to keep some sentences unrecorded. They met again on a late August evening, 2009, faces altered by the mileage of years, and yet instantly familiar, as if the day in 1991 had only just turned its head and been coaxed to look back. In the days that followed, leaks and headlines tumbled into the world at their usual velocity. The hidden yard in Antioch was shown from above, from the side, in crude sketches and careful diagrams. The arc of the story compressed itself into the speed of news. Seemingly, everyone had something to say, a version of events to rehearse, but beneath the public narrative ran the quieter work. There were interviews paced not by the clock, but by breath. There were counselors who understood how to measure time differently, by thresholds crossed and numbness thawed. There were legal proceedings for Philip and Nancy, whose names now carried the weight of charges and the silent noise of courtroom air. There were case numbers and dates and the kind of paperwork that is a civilization's attempt to name harm and place it in a ledger. For JC and her daughters, there were firsts tucked inside ordinary acts. The first time a door opened without a key kept elsewhere. The first time a window looked onto a street that she could step onto without permission. The first time the voice of a neighbor carried through the evening and sounded like a possibility instead of a threat. Grocery store aisles were vast, blinking with options. The smell of laundry from a machine in another room felt like a story told by someone who loved her. Silence changed flavor, no longer sharpened by dread, now merely a space to fill or not fill. She learned again to wear her name comfortably, to let it ring and rest, to let it introduce her and not scare her. When the state's attorneys presented their case, they spoke for hours about years, and yet no speaking could be sufficient to balance what those years contained. The law did what it could, which is never all of what is needed, and the court offered outcomes that felt both necessary and insufficient by design, because the past cannot be erased, only contained and named and held at a distance by offensive consequences. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, choices began to stack in front of JC like bright stones on a path. Some days she chose quiet. Some days she chose loud. Some days she chose to remain still and let the sun find her where she Saturday. In her own time, she began to write. She found that language, when it is not being used to threaten or confuse, can become scaffolding. She wrote about mornings that made sense. She wrote about the night sounds she now loved. She wrote about the moment her name returned to her in a room that smelled like coffee and printer paper and relief. She wrote about love and how it had survived in a hidden place, stubborn as grass, finding the smallest crack in concrete and insisting on green. She wrote for herself first, then for her daughters, then for anyone who needed to know that the story did not end with a gate opening. The story continued into kitchens and parks and classrooms and quiet late nights in rooms where the walls were just walls and the doors were just doors. There is a photograph taken long after the late August day, when the world learned her name again. In it, the light is ordinary. The frame is sweet with nothingness. A table is set. A window shows a sliver of an afternoon that has not been arranged for television. There are no tarps, no shed doors, no hinges that stick. The weight in the photo lives not in what is seen, but in what is missing. The backyard that had swallowed 18 years does not exist here. There is only the open fact of a life going forward, even if forward sometimes means a small step and then a pause, a breath, and then another step. If you listen closely to how such stories end, you will hear that they often refuse to click shut like a latch. Recovery is not a straight hallway, but a series of rooms that open into other rooms. Still, there are endings that feel right because they are honest about what was taken and clear about what remains possible. In this story, the ending is not triumph shouted from a rooftop, nor is it a curtain falling on a stage built entirely of sorrow. It is a closing that understands the magnitude of a morning in South Lake Tahoe and the vast courage it took to speak a name out loud 18 years later in a small office near Berkeley. It is a closing that sees a mother and a daughter standing together in the kind of sunlight that does not ask for anything in return. So the last image is quiet. A front door stands open to a world that is, finally, simply a world. In the distance, an ordinary bus exhales and moves on. A name is spoken, once, clearly, just to feel its shape. Then the door is gently closed, not in fear, not to hide, but with the calm assurance of someone who knows that inside is safe and outside is just a day unfolding. The latch settles, the house breathes. And the story, held steady by the people who refused to forget and by the person who survived, comes to rest without fanfare, complete in its own measured way.